Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I would like to introduce our panel first, maybe in order. Krishna, Sankar, can you go first, please?
Yep. Hi, my name is Krishna Shankar. I work at U.S.Bank in their enterprise AI and analytics group. My role is a distinguished engineer AI. One of the things that I'm focusing on is E3, which is basically explainability, experimentation, and ethics. The questions are, of course, how do we scale models? The question is of a model factory, right? How can you, instead of building models, how can you build a model factory so that we can do a lot more experimentation? And of course, once we do that one, we also have to think about complex models, weak signals, etc., etc. So it becomes a lot more interesting, and that's where explainability and rest of the domain comes in the picture.
Awesome, thank you, Krishna. Now move to Daniel Stahl from U.S.Bank.
Hey, I'm Daniel Stahl, and I head up our data platforms team at Regions, which is a large regional bank here in the southeast of the United States. Much like Krishna was saying, part of my responsibility is to create a model factory to be able to scale our model practices. Before I worked here in the data and analytics organization, I worked in model risk management in the second line. And before that, in audit analytics in the third line. So I've seen all three lines from a model risk perspective.
Awesome. Thank you, Daniel. And then we have Laurie Nunes from JPMorgan & Chase.
Hey, everybody. So my name is Laurie Nunes. I'm a senior data scientist at JPMorgan. I head global AI/ML initiatives specifically for wealth management technology. Sort of unlike Krishna or Daniel's experience, my job, my responsibilities mostly is to, ideate on AI/ML use cases, get business buy-in, and integrate it to the whole business process and see it end to end. So we go through a lot of governance process, we go through a lot of end-to-end process, but at the end of the day, we evaluate the models not just on how it performs, but its actual impact on business.
Awesome. Then finally, Ioannis from Royal Bank of Canada.
Hey everyone, I'm Ioannis, the director of ML from RBC, part of the marketing science team, where I lead the team of 6 strong over there. We're sending out marketing offers. Hopefully they accept them. And it's similar to what Laurie was mentioning. We're part of the money making part of RBC. But previously I was more in the other side, like the other 2 speakers that we have here. Not in the model risk, but more in the sales practices and conduct, where I had the opportunity to think a bit more about ethics in AI. And before that, I was part of the enterprise data science team of RBC. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we have great representation from all aspects of data science and banking, from model risk to platforms to business adoption of machine learning. Let's start with model risk. Maybe let's start with Krishna. Krishna, I think the role of model risk has changed over the last 10 years, right? How is AI playing a larger role, and how are teams thinking about AI risk management? Is there a framework that is useful, according to you?
Yeah, good question. First of all, like we all know, the explosion of computational capabilities as well as the data, right? Ability of data has changed the whole paradigm, right? Paradigm of building models, etc. Yes, AI is one of them. First thing is, earlier we could look at an algorithm and then look at the parameters and say, oh yeah, if it is a linear regression, we know this much, so we can look at it and say, yeah, we'll be able to make an estimate of what the model does. Now what happens is algorithm and model are totally different, right? Algorithm plus data is model. So if you look at 1 trillion parameter, you don't know whether it is a cat versus dog, classifier, or is it a traffic sign classifier, or is it an NLP? Of course, I don't think you'll have 1 trillion for a cat versus dog, but still, who knows, right? So that is where it gets into trouble. So the models have become, you won't be able to know unless and until there are some interesting things that you. So these are the challenges. So this is where the risk comes in. One more final point, the AI model risk is a wicked problem. So there is a term called wicked problems. Wicked problems are like, let me make sure, you don't understand the problem unless and until you start solving it. So that is one characteristic. Second is no stopping road. It's not like, oh yeah, we have solved AI ethics or explainability. And the third one is it's only satisfying solutions, right? Every time we do something, we figure out. So that is why the challenges comes in, right? The challenges and the risks come in because of all of these things coming together into a particular domain. Here it is ML AI modeling, using complex architectures, etc.
Got it. Awesome. So moving to Daniel, you have worked on both platforms and risk management, right? How do you conduct governance of models today? How does this process differ from traditional models that were there before, the quantitative models in banks?
Yeah, and I was thinking as Krishna was giving his, and I agree completely with your perspective, Krishna. But I think I want to have a little bit of a different emphasis. So when in the wake of the Great Recession in 2009, SR 11.7 came out, written by David Palmer, and that was really the first framework, if you will, from a regulatory perspective around model risk for financial institutions. And as I read that, and David Palmer might disagree with me on this, and he's obviously right since he wrote it, but as I read that, I really think that the intent of SR 11.7 was to address a lot of the models that were perceived to be leading to or contributing to the Great Recession of 2009. So these would be models like mortgage-backed security models, pricing models, things that were actually online, live, and interacting with the market. Then with the advent of Dodd-Frank, it pivoted. So instead of purely, at least in the retail banking area, instead of looking at capital market models only, it pivoted to capital planning and stress testing models. And that was really the framework that was in place for almost a decade through the 2010s up until 2020. And as I think about that, I bring that up for two reasons. One is we've already seen that SR 11.7 and the regulatory framework that came around that is flexible enough to address different types of models. And secondly, SR 11.7 was actually built for models or written with certain models in mind that are actually very similar to the problems that we're trying to solve in the AI space. Mm-hmm. These are very complex models mathematically. They are ones that interact with their environment, and you don't always know what that feedback loop is going to look like. So when I think about AI risk governance, I think it's actually, we have a good framework for it holistically from a regulatory perspective. It's how do we now implement that from a governance perspective and as a first line, second line, third line. And I think some of the things that Krishna, you were talking about from a data perspective and compute perspective, that's been a game changer. And it requires a different mentality. No longer are we doing batch-based predictions that run every quarter, every 6 months. It's something that's now making millions of predictions in real time, and we have to have a different mindset and a different tooling set to accommodate that.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's a good segue to Laurie. Laurie, as a data scientist on the first line, building models for wealth management, what are some of the things that you are looking at in order to convince your business users to adopt machine learning, and whether that explainability or monitoring? What does the day-to-day look for you to adopt machine learning in business workflows?
Well, the first thing is, what impact does this model have on your current business process? And can you actually integrate this in your current business process? Is this something that is cost effective in integrating in your current business process? Does it make sense? And so when we communicate that with our business stakeholders, then we get the buy-in that, okay, do a POC or go on with your model building. And when we do POC, rather, proof of concept, right? When we do our proof of concept, now all the governance, all the methodologies come into play, because I feel governance starts at the proof of concept stage. Mm-hmm. You don't think of it at the end of the process, because if you just think, oh, okay, this would sort itself out when we go to production, you're going to have a problem. So I think the governance mentality from a data science perspective starts at the proof of concept stage. How do we get the data? Where do we get the data? There's a paper, I think published by some of the Google scientists, called hidden technical debt in machine learning. And I think those boxes around AI/ML modeling is just a small part of it. There's feature engineering, there's all those things. Those boxes around AI/ML engineering should have an AI governance perspective from a POC, from a proof of concept stage. And once we're done with that, we iterate through our results. And then finally, when we get to a result that is good enough for the business, and here's one thing: good enough might be 80%, might be 75%. If you go for a really complex model that just gives you a 1% bump, it might not be worth it from a risk perspective or from an explainability perspective. Once you get to that good enough, at least you have your AI governance already in place. So that would get even more buy-in, and that would allow us to push to production.
Got it. And so, Ioannis, as you push models into these marketing use cases, right? What do you hear from your business users around how they are working? How do you sort of build trust with how they can use those models in production today?
It is interesting to hear everybody here, because I can hear the same flavors of and I'm kind of the other spectrum. I'm a bit of a more risk tolerant, let's say, and I think risk is not a bad thing. It's not something inherently evil that comes with everything that we do, right? I definitely see it as an opportunity. The larger the risk that you assume, the bigger the reward that you might reap. You just want to be dangling along that fine line. That is, okay, we're good enough to go, and then we can reap everything, reap the good, the wealth that comes with it. I believe risk, current model risk has in any organization has 3 layers, because I heard Daniel speak that there is a framework that it has been around 10 years, and when I tried to push an NLP solution at RBC, it was very challenging to tell you to fit it in that box, because it was like, what is stress testing for an NLP models, right? So there are, I think it is more, it has 3 different layers. First, you come from the organizational layer. It's based on the risk appetite that each organization has, right? It's different to think a startup and a big financial institution. Like a big established financial institution will have definitely a lower risk appetite than a startup that has a certain horizon in the future to make some progress, right? They're inherently more willing to assume risks. Secondly, I think it's use case specific. Different use cases have different implied risks. It's another thing that, okay, here is a card for a credit card that it comes free. You have $5,000 credit limit, and okay, just use it. It's just an offer, right? It's nothing harmful. It's something that you can gain. But it's another thing to get declined from a mortgage.
Yeah.
It is then the scrutiny and the risk from a brand perspective is definitely huge. And the third thing, is what Krishna talked about, is which the model specific risk, which for sure novel models will carry more risk because they are more untested. That is what how the cookie crumbles, right? It's not that something. The newer the clones that you bring into the table, the more testing that you need to do in order to make sure that this is going to work in the future. So when you put these things together, I think you can come up with a methodology to ensure that this model is you're fine with the risk level of this combination that you have at hand, and then you can put that in perspective.
Got it. So just to go back, I think now if in order to establish like that the model is risky or some sort of like a risk rating, Krishna, how do you go about assessing this risk? In fact, let's say a team is building, as you said, very complex models with like lots of parameters. Now, how do you go about assessing these as the risks in a more practical sense?
Oh yeah, no, I know that as other panelists mentioned, the risk depends on its effect on the customers, right? So And also the importance. For example, if it is a loan and loan application, that has a lot more risk to it. So the risk is it is a so first of all, complexity, right? Complexity of the model architecture, absolutely, right? That is an important one. The other thing, yesterday I was talking to somebody, and they were talking about saying that the thing that you have to worry about is how would you know that if the model is not right, right? So that is because yes, it might work for some places. So that is where you have to look at and say, will you be able to put a boundary around it? Will you be able to put guardrails around it? So that is that side of the story. And as mentioned, the statistical significance doesn't mean business significance. Right. So you can look at it and say, oh, I got a model that is 50% better, but there is no business significance. Then it is not right. So these are some of the things that you look at from a risk perspective. You also have to look at the pipeline and say what is the risk from a regulatory perspective. Right, because you do all these things and you have all of these things in place, and the regulators come in, and will you be able to show that one, right? So that is that side of the story. And also, how would you customers come back and say, okay, two things, right? Things like counterfactuals, right? They say, okay, fine, I know that I can't get the loan now, but what should I do to get the loan? Right? And the same thing, right? We don't want to build churn models. We want to stop churn. Right? Our goal is not building churn models. Our goal is not building fraud models. So that means you need the fidelity of the model has to be there. Of course, doing all of these things in the model side, you have to also look at the data layer. Right? What kind of data are you getting, and the whole set of are the right data, etc. Right? And then of course all of these things, and then you have the fair and responsible banking, all the bias, etc. Right? Even if you have the model, it is working fine, everything is good, but it does some strange things for a certain class of people. Right? At that point, you have to look at it and say, no, it will not work. We do have to do something about it.
So that's a good point. So assessing model risk in one snapshot is an interesting thing. But like Daniel, when you actually deploy the model, teams have realized, during pandemic that models do deteriorate in performance, right? So there's like an ongoing risk of maintaining models. How do you, being a platform, manager, operate like models in a manner so that you're controlling this risk on an ongoing manner?
Well, I just want to point out that use case is a very important part. And I do want to address a question that also came up in the chat around the regulatory framework around explainable ML. We pick use cases for ML that are not risky from a regulatory perspective. We pick ones like fraud. I mean, there's so much low-hanging fruit when it comes to ML use cases within the business. We don't have to go directly to credit scoring, for example, which would, of course, be a very highly risky area to go into. So when we think about actually monitoring our risk for models as they go into production, we borrow a lot of the concepts from what software engineering has developed over the last 20 years or so. We have a DevOps approach to our model deployments. We have everything defined as code so that you can take a look at whatever the version of the code was at any point in time. You understand everything about the production environment, including how the model was trained and what the models that you have in production are, what version of the model, what version of the data, et cetera, that model that is in production is using. We also borrow tools, telemetry tools from the software engineering world. So we do layer a lot of the tools that have been available for monitoring real-time applications, and we apply that to models. Again, we have additional second line review that doesn't exist in the software engineering world with model risk management, but we do try to marry those two worlds, the risk management side and the software engineering side. I think so far we've been very successful at that.
Right. So when it comes to low risk models per se, Ioannis, especially for marketing models, how important it is to have ongoing model monitoring? Have you seen effects of model deterioration even with the churn models that you manage today?
Yeah. COVID is a great example. Some models, especially the ones that haven't been trained for a while, then actually the more explainable models like linear regression and very simple ones actually, they started behaving really weirdly. Because the biggest thing, there are so many things that could go wrong in prod. There are so many things, like especially engineering, which is actually the biggest part of what we should pay attention to. But from our standpoint, is that we have to pay attention to the non-stationarity of the world that we live in. Like, data change, behaviors change, people change, even the climate changes. Like, you can't even predict the weather right now. So you have to pay close attention on feature distributions to see how they change over time. You have to pay a score distributions, and then one thing that guides us, especially from a marketing perspective, because as Laurie is a money making business, we have the business KPIs at the end of the day. If those are not increasing, or the those are not satisfied, we have to monitor them. When we do monitor them, we do A/B tests all the time for that particular reason. And we pulled a lot of models during COVID down because we don't need the computer. We don't not getting anything out of that out of the situation that we're put in. So that's why right now, currently, we're trying to re-emerge, as the business say, from a marketing perspective, and try to renormalize everything that we did. But again, your training data right now is from a COVID period, and then you're trying to get out, and again, it's the non-stationarity that you have to somehow factor into your modeling aspect.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. I think there are some, some tech companies who blogged about it. I think Instacart, blogged about how their models deteriorated in performance from 90% accuracy to 65% because of pandemic. So this is definitely an issue that every team is facing. Going back to Laurie, so Laurie, you're building models, let's say for portfolio management and cash distribution use cases. How do the business users on your side or consuming these models, how are they comfortable? Where does explainable AI come into this picture? To sort of help them use the model outputs today.
So before I go to that, Krishna, I'd like to add also to
Yeah,
what
please.
Krishna and Daniel mentioned about model governance and business criticality. So I deal with model governance as well, because especially for higher tiered in terms of risk models, we have several business governance teams, from a line of business governance team, and a firm-wide business governance team. And normally the level of oversight given to our models depend on how critical the model is. And model criticality is, does the model have a direct impact on business decisions? What do you mean by direct impact? If I have, let's say, if it's a decision, if it's a model that makes a decision, just for example, let's just take for example, because I don't want to give specifics here, obviously. If this is a model that spits out a decision, in the current state there are 3 people doing that, right? So if the model replaces those 3 people, that's highly critical, and the governance for that model is it's very large. But if there are 3 people doing that level of work right now, and your model probably is replacing 1 people, that's still a very high risk model, right? And the level of governance is still high, but not as high to when you're replacing 3. But if the model is what we call an analytical tool, which just is recommending an action to either of those 3 people, then the conversation is different. So it's how you really think about where you inject your model in your business decision making process. And from a banking perspective, like, okay, if I get these 3 decision, and again, I'm speaking in general, I'm not giving any specific use cases. If I use this model for these 3 people, for what's the value add? I get operational efficiency versus the risk. So as a business, you have to juggle that. Now, going back to your question, Krishna, how do you engender trust in your model? You start small, because normally as humans, we have resistance. Like, I'm the domain expert. I know everything. Not really I know everything, but I know what's going on. And, this model might not be, especially if it's new, right? So to me, what I normally do, I start as an analytical tool. Like, hey, let it recommend to you. You are the decision maker. This would just add additional data points to your process. They get comfortable with the system, they get comfortable with the platform, they see the model results, they see how the model arrived at the results. They're able to say, okay, yeah, this is wrong, correct, this is wrong. These are the explainability factors. I don't agree, this is correct, this is wrong. You give them a platform to share their feedback with your model as an analytical tool. And you get two things. You get data from them, and you make them comfortable with your system. So that's kind of how we're thinking about it.
Yeah. So I guess there is actually an interesting question from the Q&A. Let me just take a few questions. One is, let me actually take this other question. So Krishna, there is this rise of post-hoc explainability algorithms, from Shapley values to integrated gradients. So how do you sort of, think about their sort of existence and their ability to satisfy regulators within the current sort of banking setup?
Satisfying the regulators come at the end, right? The first thing is understanding the models. Understanding the models from multiple perspectives, right? While developing, like Laurie mentioned, it is with the business folks, right? You look at it and say, okay, this is a model. These are some of the, we can actually look at it and say, okay, we can segment them and then look at the feature importance. For example, we can compare the feature importance, etc., and say, hey, on this day this happened, on this day this happened. So the business would be able to look at it and say, yeah, this makes sense. This is because there will be some underlying business event that happened. So that is one way of using the algorithms. And the second way of using the algorithms is, of course, this is during development, right? So this is where one of the other question was that, how do you stop churn, right? You don't want to build churn models, you want to stop churn. So this is where you can actually look at and say, just for example, right? Just for example, if the voice quality goes down, right? And then you see a lot of churn happening, right? You might be able to look at it and say, yeah, this is because suppose in your model you also have this voice quality as one of the features. You might be able to look at it and say, last 3 months, a lot of people left and my voice quality was going down.
Right.
So immediately you can look at it and say, in order to stop churn, what I need to do is I need to improve my voice quality.
Right.
This is just a simple example, right? But you will be able to get these examples. So that is where explainability comes in the picture. And of course, the third one is regulators, right? The fact that a company has thought through and it has a, I don't want to say sophisticated, but it has a mature explainability layer. Right, explainability and monitoring layer, right? The two sides, the model diagnostics as well as the model monitoring. The fact that it has it and it is incorporated, like Laurie said, it is not an afterthought. It is embedded in your process. That itself makes it, right? Daniel also was mentioning. I think Ioannis was mentioning similar this thing, right? So long as if it is embedded in your process, that itself adds value to your process, and that itself adds. That itself adds confidence from the regulators that, these things are there. Otherwise, if they look at it and say, I look at it, this makes sense, but I have no clue why that is happening. And then the regulators will say, I got it. Right?
So anyone wants to add it? I mean, there's this rise of post-hoc explainable AI. I'm sure like you're all using some of these open source libraries or tools. How is it going with regulators and inside the bank, in terms of adoption and trusting those explanations?
Well, and I think I'll piggyback on something that Laurie was saying as well. There's actually multiple stakeholders when it comes to explainability. The first stakeholder is the data scientists themselves. They need an explanation for what their model is doing so that they know where their model is weak or where it might be doing something that they don't expect, right? It's a way for them to diagnose their model and come away feeling more strong about how their model is going to be performing. Second is going to be it's going to be the business unit who is going to be using this model to make decisions. And I think it's very important to involve the business throughout the development of the model, have a cross-functional team that includes stakeholders in the line of business. And then once you serve predictions to them, having explanations for why they're seeing what they're seeing goes a long way to having them adopt it and have trust in that model. Then, of course, other internal stakeholders, compliance and model risk, having something for them to be able to peel back the onion, if you will, and see how the model is really performing. And then, of course, finally, the regulators as well.
Yeah, well said. Just this thing, right? That's exactly, you have to look at multiple stakeholders, including the customers, right? Remember the recent codes, etc. So validators, customers, regulators, business, and the data scientists. Well said, Daniel. Well said.
Anyone has any comments to add on the rise of post-hoc explainability within banking?
Not really about post hoc, but I feel there's a gap, and I'm just thinking out loud here. I feel that, okay, we're talking so much about model explainability, how models are explained. Is anybody talking about explainability on how data is being labeled? Because one of the things that we notice, especially we use a lot of pre-trained models, and that's fine. We know they get it from Reddit, we know whatever. But if you have internally labeled pre-trained data, are the regulators looking at it? Do they know how it's being labeled? Do they know there's bias in labeling? So also that aspect, I'm just bringing that up. I mean, I don't know whether that's relevant, but I feel there's a gap there on explainability on data labeling.
Yeah, makes sense. So let's.
Yeah, I would say.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm just going to say on the NLP and vision side, I think that labeling is becoming more and more of an issue, at least for us, as we're starting to see issues with some of the labeling aspects. Not anything that I don't think the regulators would care about, because this is all in non-risky areas, but definitely something that we're concerned about in terms of the accuracy of our models.
They would also think about the mix of the data, right? Probably whatever, right? If you have a particular class, the data has abundance of data from a particular class, and then it has less data somewhere else, right? Then the model reflects what is in the data,
Yeah.
right? And it can't, there is no common sense anywhere, right? So so that is where it gets a lot more interesting in that sense.
So that's a good point. Now we are talking about this whole bias in models, and models can be biased if your data is not sampled properly and all of that, right? So this is obviously a new thing, and the machine learning could amplify bias and then other ways. And how is that? This could make things worse. We have seen what happened with Apple, Goldman Sachs, whatever really happened, we don't know, but at least the news story came out in the last 2 years ago. How do you think about these things? Maybe you can start with Ioannis. I don't know if it affects like your marketing models as such, but in general, like how do you think about the algorithmic discrimination?
It doesn't, but I believe for us to be responsible in what we're doing, and responsibility can take like a lot of aspects, right? It's a very philosophical essence. What is a responsible adult, right? Nobody could if I ask the 5 people that we have here, we're gonna have with different answers. But at least we want to be for our models, we want to be transparent and fair at all times. And what that means is transparent is how we came up with the answer, how we came up with that offer that reached the downstream client. And also to be fair to our protected variables. We have certain protected variables that we want to be fair and being treated at the same or almost the same, because every protected variable has different preferences, but at the same time you want to be like not to have complete disparities in there. And at all times we have to monitor those properties frequently and with purpose, right? That's how we see, and that's what we're doing for the past year. Another in my previous team actually was because it was a bit more sensitive. So we were talking about sales practices, right? And we were monitoring behaviors of sale activity. We did extensive research on the actual conversations that went there, and if they came from a male individual or from a female individual, what was the dynamic between the client and the employee. Excellent work that came out from our EMRM, model risk team. So that's the second line that helped us a lot towards that work. But it is something that each team has to think about it for themselves, and maybe they come up with different answers. But I think at the bare minimum for us, even if we're again we don't really care that much. I don't want to use the care because we definitely care. We want to be responsible, but at the bare minimum, we should have these type of properties for our models.
Yeah, makes sense. Anyone wants to add on like this whole sort of algorithmic discrimination and bias detection, how this is happening within your organizations?
I want to add another dimension to it, the philosophical discussion.
Yeah.
I'll take 2 minutes, right? The reason
Please.
right? Because those things will happen in other places as well, right? The first of this thing is we humans are linear machines, right? We exponential systems, literally we can't handle them, right? We wouldn't understand them. The second is if you look at anything, right? Whether it is a reason codes for loans or why vaccination is good or bad, we need thoughtful and disciplined curation. This always on, it doesn't work for us, right? So then what happens is, and also we can't judge the unintended consequences,
right?
So all of these things together, in the end, right? The platforms will be definitely liable, right? Not liable because the platforms did anything, but because they didn't do something probably, right? The other of omission rather than the other of commission and all of those things, right? And that is where some of the bias is one of the important ones on that one, right? Because it, like you said, it amplifies things, right? Yeah. And now the question is, how do you know what it should amplify is the right thing to amplify? Again, this is where this gets into one of the things that there was another panel that I was in, and where they were talking about that these AI ML models are not a technical artifact; they are a social artifact. So you can't just take a model and deploy it somewhere. You have to think of and say, how can I know Laurie mentioned that one, right? How can you integrate the model into a system? Right, it is not just directly. Just
which humans is it interacting with? Yeah, that's very important as well.
Yeah, that's very important. And so these things come in the picture. So one has to think of those things, and that is why we were talking about earlier. This is a wicked problem. You won't be able to solve it in one shot and go away. You wouldn't know how to solve it unless and until you solve it, because we are not only solving the technical problem, right? Technical, you can say if it doesn't like, for example, people with glasses, you can give more pictures with people with glasses, or you can crop it and you can turn it around and you can do all kinds of strange things, right? But that's not the point. The point is a lot more deeper than that.
Right.
Yeah, I think a couple of things that I wanted to piggyback off there. The fact that models, so anything that interacts with an ecosystem or within an ecosystem impacts that system. So a model, though, has additional risk in the sense that, especially for self-learning or reinforcement learning models, there's a direct feedback loop to the things that model is going to predict based off the environment that is placed into. So when I think about responsibility in AI, to me, it's about being deliberate about understanding your model and being deliberate about the choices that you make for that model in that environment. So understanding what the model can do, how the model could potentially interact with the environment, and then being okay with that, or being deliberate about what you're going to be okay with versus not being okay with. And just to get a little bit on a soapbox here, I'm not a huge fan of ethical AI. I think responsible AI is good, but AI is not ethical. Humans are ethical, right? It's up to us to make that ethical choice, but we have to understand the models and its implications before we can make that ethical choice.
Yeah.
One thing I'd like to add to more of a practical aspect to it. So does it mean, like, to us, we've done two things, because we've seen some annotations that are standardized and some annotations that are not standardized, because people, label one way versus people label another way.
Right.
Does it make sense to have a centralized team that sort of oversees that? And, is this a new job function? Or maybe there's already a job for it that oversees it and sees, annotations drift over time, see bias before they happen. That's one way we can be proactive. That's one way we can be responsible. Because if we're just collecting data ad hoc, then we don't know the quality of that. And also, there was one question addressed to me. I'd like to quick whether or not, when you have complex models versus simple models, which one do you prefer? Personally, simple models. Because simple models are easier to explain. Now, if we get a bump of, a significant bump because of complex models, then there is a way, then we could talk about it. But to me, it's massaging the data and simple models to start. And normally when we hit that threshold, that 1% or 2%, could be offset by the complexity of deploying a complex model or monitoring the complex model or explaining that complex model.
Yeah.
Laurie, I agree with you on that, but something that Ioannis was bringing up before about the regime shifts that can occur and the way that models can start behaving differently when the underlying data shifts. If you have a complex model that actually is able to better accommodate regime changes, which could happen conceivably, because a complex model allows for far more complex boundaries, and you're not just stuck with this linear approach. I could see that being a reason to go with a complex model. But in general, yes, I completely agree that be as simple as you can.
Or do backups, do parallel model deployments.
That's right. Yeah.
Daniel, what I found though is benchmarking with simpler models. That is always the case, and then you start building. But it's not the complexity for the sake of complexity. You have to have a strong case of how the structure of the data. There is actually a very good discussion of the geometry of the problem that you're trying to solve. So if you could capture, and that's why, for example, CNNs were so popular with images, right? Because they were capturing these properties that they needed. It was the structure of the algorithm, right? If you can find something that fits your problem, right, then it's worth the added complexity. It's not that we're going to build like a neural net that has billions of parameters just for the sake of building something like that, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. This is such a great discussion. I almost don't want to chime in, but this is such a flow that you're all in. Let me just take some audience question. We have 15 minutes to end. So there was a question around what are the metrics to measure the performance of explainable algorithms in banking domain? I guess this is probably a twofold question. How do you probably validate explainability, but also probably how do you measure the performance of the AI algorithms in general? So it's probably means two things, and they're probably two different. Anyone wants to take that?
I don't know what it means. Like if I give you an explanation, how can you tell if it's good or bad?
Yeah, so that is probably one way to look at it. The other way is probably also to just see like how we are, understanding the performance of AI algorithms in general.
So in one of the systems I've worked with, we think we used Lime at the start because it was 2 years ago, and then we changed to SHAP. But you know how you have all these factors. So as I said, this is a system or a platform. We show them the explainable factors as given by Lime, and then they just check. It's like, okay, I agree, I disagree, and then for others that are not within that list, they would add that in. And then as somebody reading that, I said, oh, we don't have that in our feature set. How come they use this to explain their decision? So that's also one thing, that feedback loop from our users. And then we just look at it qualitatively.
Yep. I think there's a related question around the standard metric to check the quality of explanations, which I think is a hard problem, right? I mean, it's kind of like, every human might agree or disagree, and there's also a confirmation bias, I might want to see what I want to expect from the model and from explanation, but you want the explanation to be faithful to the model or faithful to the human that's judging the explanation. It's all like complex.
Faithful to the business is the thing to do, right? I have a couple of thoughts on the metrics, right? One is you can do segmentation, right? You can do overlay model scores over various latent variables and those kind of stuff. You can even do intersectional impact, right? You can look at it and say men over 60 from Midwest or new customers under 25, right? You can. So these are all statistical. The more interesting part is the local explainability, the counterfactuals, right? What does it take to flip one, right? And remember, this is what we are talking about and saying, how can I stop this person from check, or why do you mean that this is fraud, etc. Right? And then you have tons of possibilities in many directions.
Yep, makes sense.
I want to take one more quick this thing. There was a question on the Singapore standard.
Yeah, please, yeah.
So, interestingly enough, I was talking about it yesterday with one of my colleagues. So it's interesting that the that there is an RFI coming from the various bodies, FCC, etc. Right, and then so one thing is, like Daniel, you mentioned, the framework is in place, but probably we could use some more guidance. Right, the reason the guidance works is because if there is a guidance or a recommendation of something like that, that makes it easy when you have the discussions with the regulators. So going back to the question, the Singapore, they were able to do it easier because it's a smaller state and there is a lot more central control to it. So they could do that in one shot, right? So what most probably will happen, it's actually not a good practice to predict the future, right? We shouldn't predict the future. But anyway, the most probably what will happen is we will get some guidance, right? That's what we need, right? Right, Daniel? We don't need new rules, but we need some guidance which says, yes, things have changed since the SLM had come. Now, these are some of the things that you can do. And by the way, that also is an impetus from you, Krishna, from companies, the vendors, as well as the users, all of us.
Yep.
Right. So we together we look at it and say, yeah, these are some of the things that we need to do, and then we talk with the vendors implement them, etc. And then we will be able to when the regulators come in, they look at it and say, yeah, this makes sense.
Yeah.
Right? Because you do need to do some level of looking at various things and say what works and how does it work. And like Laurie mentioned, this will be, and also I think Ioannis also mentioned it, will be different for different businesses.
Right.
Anyway, so to back to the question, yes, we might end up looking at the Singapore and adding something, but it is still the current stage, at least as far as I know. NIST also has an RFI out. The regulators and NIST, etc., they are looking at the things and they are studying the domain.
Yeah, absolutely.
Krishna?
I think, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. No, go
I
ahead.
was just like adding, coming from the tech sector, we didn't, when I was at Facebook, we didn't have any notion of model risk management or any notion of, governance of models, right? So, I've been working on machine learning for some time, and you would generally, just train and model, test it on the test data set, and then, run an A/B test, deploy it. But
fail fast and break things and all those things.
Quick experimentation, fast moving things. And I think like when we studied this MRM, and this is actually something that every other industry could adopt. So I'm glad that there's also some sort of thought leaders here that want to improve this process. So Ioannis, you want to talk about it?
No, I definitely agree with Krishna's approach. The industry and the governments should come together, and maybe the global governments should come together. But there is one pillar missing from that, and that is the academia. We're looking at the academia to solve that's the first point of solution for all our problems, right? Especially for new architectures, for new things to come out. But we haven't seen that much from them in terms of responsible AI, ethical AI, even if Daniel doesn't like it. But we haven't seen much research on that front. For sure, they don't have the proper data sets. Banking, they're never going to release data sets for the academia to study. But I'm not sure if there is an incentive out there for the academia to start researching that topic a bit more. There are some steps. I'm not saying that they're not doing anything about it, but if you wait like state of the art in one data set to responsible AI, I think it's something it's a bit imbalanced over there. So I would definitely like to see more incentives in the academic world to help us solve that problem and come into the discussion at least.
On a related note, there is an exciting talk today from a professor at Harvard who's working on this. The topic is around towards reliable and practical algorithmic recourse. So it's at 10:45. If anyone is listening to this thing, this is an academic professor working on this field, trying to advance, fairness and explainability in AI. But yeah, definitely, I agree with Ioannis. I think there could be more that can be done here.
There is one tiny problem, Ioannis, on that one, simply because responsible AI is a policy, right? And it is a nebulous thing, right? So that is where the challenge is, right? The devil is in the details, right? If you look at just for example, Facebook's responsible AI pillars. Right? I'm just taking one example, right? Just like fair and inclusion, private and security, transparency, robustness and safety, etc. You take and say general principles and ethical norms from China, right? You compare them. They're actually even they're sequenced the same. It's interesting that you could go and look at them, and they're even the sequence is the same. So the point is the definition. I know Daniel doesn't like any of these things, right? I'm just kidding. The reason is responsible AI. You can define it. The good news is top level principles are agreed upon or it's common. The bad news is the devil is in the details. And that is where the challenge is. So that academia probably cannot get a handle on things, right? You can put mathematical equations or linear algebra or etc. on top of responsible AI.
Yeah. But economists do that all the time, though.
Yeah. It's a cross-domain problem, right? You need law, psychology, sociology. It's not a purely math problem. So you need all these aspects of academia working together. Yeah. So I just don't know how much of that is happening.
Yeah, that's
I also think that academia has a little bit. So a Facebook is used by 3 billion people in the world. Nothing in academia's got that scale, so they don't have the same problems that companies do.
Yeah. So on that note, I think just a little bit on that, like more practical sense, like where academia could handle. So there's a question from the audience around what are current practices for explaining deep learning models based on NLP? Additionally, on top of what Daniel mentioned about labeling issues, how do you approach fixing the labeling bias in those data sets? I think this is a huge problem. We talked about bias amplification. How are you seeing this kind of being addressed, or any challenges that you're seeing?
I can give a very quick answer on the labeling side. A few weeks ago, there was a couple of conferences from Facebook. So they had a thing called label flow. I thought it was an very interesting concept. I mean, again, and of course, a lot of people are saying they are missing a lot of things, etc. That is fine. But conceptually, it's an interesting. I'm sure, Laurie, if you have seen it, you will like it, because it literally talks to what you are thinking of. Whether they did it fully well or not, but they have some interesting, and there is a video as well on level flow.
So how we did it is we have a centralized annotation team that sort of oversees the annotation, and we also have a voting mechanism. For instance, like if we show them the different things that they label, and then maybe that same thing that they need to label is being shown to 2-3 people. Ideally, they all agree. If they don't, then it has to go up to your centralized team.
Any other thoughts on addressing label bias from the panel?
I think adversarial attacks also help, like hardening.
Good
so that space.
Got it. So I think Henry is here to give us.
Well, I think that was a very engaging discussion that we had with all the panelists. So thank you all. But I do think we need some break in between the sessions. We were, going through a long hours of video sitting down. So I do want everyone to kind of take a water break, stand up for a little bit. So thank you, everyone. And we'll now take a very short break. It's going to be like 4 minutes. And I just wanted to take a moment to thank our sponsors, AWS, Infosys, and NVIDIA, and we'll see everyone back at 10 a.m. Pacific for the panel discussion with MLOps partners.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. And
thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good discussions.
Bye-bye.